Palestinians in Gaza are being killed by Israeli weaponry and bombs from air, land, and sea.
How do we achieve justice? To understand this question, we must understand what is a state, what are states' current approaches to achieving justice, and how the obstacles they face hint at the need for alternatives. For this video, we define a state as a set of institutions that possess a monopoly on rulemaking and legitimate use of force within a bounded territory. Now, to analyze states' approaches to justice and the obstacles that they face, we'll use Latin America as a case study. In this region, the tension between the self-interest of state leaders and their approaches to justice is especially relevant, as Latin America has held the world's highest homicide rate for more than 3 decades, about 2 to 3 times the global average. Researchers and reporters have tried explaining insecurity in Latin America by focusing on internal factors, like corruption in the country's politics or even economics. These result in incomplete and even problematic explanations, such as when they say Latin America has a culture that condones violence and crime, or xenophobic and racist remarks which have been normalized in politics. For example, Donald Trump's 2016 speeches about the U.S. southern border.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
But that's not the full picture. These statistics can't be explained by internal factors alone, because behind these problems are deeper structural explanations, including a history of colonialism, the continuities of global extractivism, the role of impunity, and foreign intervention. To highlight the impacts of these factors, let's take a closer look at how they connect. The first being impunity. Impunity is defined as the exemption from punishment or from the unpleasant consequences of an illegal or immoral act that has been done. To fully understand impunity in today's context, we must understand how it is one of the legacies of colonialism. Under colonial rule in Latin America, colonizers set up institutions that were founded on self-serving purposes. Cause, duh, it's colonialism. For example, the legal encomienda system gave conquistadores a plot of land where they were allowed to exploit indigenous populations through their forced labor and extraction of wealth from their lands. And to attempt to justify this clear immoral abuse of indigenous communities, at least they provided them with some free protection in Christianity, I guess. The encomienda system was abolished in the 18th century, but the extraction of resources from the global south by corporations from the north remains protected by impunity that exists both within these countries and internationally. And just in case you're not convinced, to further highlight impunity in the Spanish colonies, we should also consider the legal practice of obedezco pero no cumplo. This idea describes the false compliance to hierarchical authority that governed relationships in feudal Spain, which was notorious and widespread. This principle acknowledged how subordinates to the crown in the colonies pretended to revere their superiors in Madrid, but they did whatever they wanted when the lord's vassals were away. These ideas were practiced and entrenched for 300 years of colonial rule, becoming historically institutionalized. So when the elites in the new so-called independent states took over these structures, and even the same buildings, they also retained a lot of the problems that had been baked into their country's political culture. Thus, these institutions have been very difficult to uproot by the post-colonial states, which kept many of the same governance systems and structures of power even after independence from colonial states. Additionally, to explore the extent to which these factors continue to impact Latin America today, we can also take a closer look at foreign intervention, specifically the US and Latin America. Because, fun fact, from 1898 to 1994, US government interventions have successfully changed Latin American governments at least 41 times. That's a lot. And that number doesn't even get into how foreign embassies work hard each day to intervene in countries' politics, often on behalf of corporations. As we saw with Bolivia in the summer of 2024, these interventions continue to occur and affect Latin American countries. One result of these interventions, for example, is MS-13, a prominent gang in Central America. Whereas today, right-wing politicians use the group as an excuse to militarize the border and expand racist immigration policies, MS-13 wouldn't exist if it weren't for centuries-long U.S. intervention in Latin America. Like,
tonight I am calling on Congress to finally close the deadly loopholes that have allowed MS-13 and other criminal gangs to break into our country.
Let me elaborate. MS-13 actually started in Los Angeles with young Central Americans who had migrated to the U.S. to escape the violence of civil wars in their home countries, which the U.S. was fueling by funding right-wing governments and guerrillas under the guise of fighting communism. Pushed to the margins of society in the U.S., many young Salvadorans found safety in groups increasingly criminalized by police and targeted for deportation. Since the late 90s, the U.S. has deported about 31,000 individuals, which has led to the rise of the gang's transnational status and has intensified their battle with Central American governments. You may not have heard of these connections as they tend to be overlooked by news outlets in favor of getting your attention, but these deep structural issues must be part of the conversations about approaches to justice because they continue to play active roles in systemically shaping inequality in Latin America. So it's clear that the path to justice is complex. And some of you may be wondering, why don't Latin American countries just spend more money on their security? That'll lead to more safety, right? Well, they actually have. In comparison to other high-income countries like the US, Latin America and the Caribbean has spent almost double the average on public security spending. However, despite this increase in spending, high crime rates continue to persist. So yeah, it's complicated and probably not the result that some of you were expecting. And it really should push you to ask, is increasing security budgets the only way of achieving justice? Aren't there alternatives? What are these alternatives? To answer this, we can look at Latin American communities because in response to the many societal issues they face, they haven't remained silent. Let's look at how some organizations throughout the region have responded to two prominent issues, femicides and indigenous sovereignty. Specifically, we'll look at them through the lens of the following components of advocacy. First, organizing, which refers to building community bases for collective action, mobilizing, preparing our communities for mass actions, and campaigning, executing a series of activities with benchmarks, a timeline, clear objectives, and a plan for escalation. Sadly, throughout Latin America, there are terrifying statistics relating to femicides. For example, in Argentina, there was a reported 322 femicides in 2023, which was a 33% increase from 2022. And in Mexico, 10 women die per day because of femicides. And in these cases, only 27% of women's deaths are investigated. In response to the lack of political action throughout Latin America, on March 8th, known as International Women's Day, protests can be seen all over the region. But in each country, there are also feminist collectives that seek to uplift women in their communities, like Cuerpos Parlantes, a group located in Guadalajara, Mexico. Libra Cano founded the group and helps organize her local community by creating spaces of political education. Cuerpos Parlantes provides feminist courses, which they call feminarios. Cano speaks highly of the community that has been built around this organization, stating, "Over these years, feminist thinking has allowed us to recognize the need to be connected with people who are organizing. Opening up this thinking for the whole community lets us generate a deeper kind of organization in the face of problems we're dealing with, which we do through building a common understanding of the situation." This organization has also mobilized through participating in assemblies in Guadalajara for both March 8th and November 25th, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Community is a central component of the organization, which is also exemplified in La Red Mesa de Mujeres in the city of Juárez.
Es una organización, ¿verdad?, que se dedica a defender los derechos de la mujer sobre violencia doméstica, violencia en contra de la mujer. Yo en lo particular, ¿verdad?, las pláticas me han servido demasiado. He aprendido a valorarme más como mujer. Me han dado terapias.
By providing workshops on domestic violence, La Red Mesa is able to empower the women of their community by making an impact at the individual, family, and societal level. The effects of these collectives have led to the creation of larger social movements, such as La Marea Verde. This wave refers to the use of a green scarf during protests to show solidarity with feminist movements and was first seen in Argentina in 2003. This movement directly connected the national campaign for legal, safe, and free abortion to feminist movements in Argentina. In other words, local and regional movements alike have played a significant role in transforming the lives of women throughout Latin America by mixing day-to-day community organizing with visible mass actions and targeted campaigning. Latin American feminist collectives are changing the landscape that has been marked by cis heteropatriarchy, a central legacy of settler colonialism in the region. Another prominent issue that arises from the region's history of colonialism is the discrimination against indigenous groups, which has led to the formation of indigenous collectives whose structures push us to rethink the flaws in our current power structures. One of these collectives is the Confederation of Amazonian Nationalities in Peru, or CONAP, an organization of over 900 indigenous communities in Peru's Amazonian regions. In an interview with Oseas Barbaran, the president of CONAP, he speaks on the relationship of CONAP with Peruvian politicians.
No hay ningún tipo de... Los meten en una sola bolsa, como se dice, los tratan como cualquier otro peruano. No hay una atención especial no digo porque somos pobrecitos, no. Los pueblos indígenas estamos estructuralmente excluidos durante 200 años de la vida republicana. Queremos que el gobierno escuche la voz y que haya participación y que el gobierno escuche a los pueblos indígenas, sí.
From his words, we see it's clear that the indigenous community lacks important protections and support from the state. Nevertheless, CONAP has taken several actions to uplift and empower indigenous voices in their region. In COP28, leaders of the organization campaigned for their projects that rely on the indigenous economy and governance model, which centers on aspects such as indigenous economy, health and intercultural education, indigenous women, and law and participation. One of their long-term projects part of this model is Gobernanza para la Conversión. Fortunately, they have been successful in several cases. For example, on March 15, 2024, the native communities of Atalaya, Peru were granted property titles, which legally acknowledged them as owners of their land. Although they have been the protectors of the lands for centuries, this legal recognition is important as the title helps them protect themselves against environmental threats against their territory. Another one of their projects, Mujer Indígena, helps to organize the community by teaching indigenous women about administration and foundational skills to start their own businesses. Such projects help to uplift marginalized communities, empowering them through various venues such as financial freedom, rights advocacy, and the fight for indigenous sovereignty. Another exemplary case is the Confederation of the Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, or CONAI. Located in Ecuador and founded in the 1980s, they have made news headlines several times for their nationwide mobilization efforts, most recently in 2022. On June 13th of this year, indigenous communities organized a national strike, blocking roads and marching through cities in response to the president at the time, President Lasso's lack of support in the face of the rising cost of living. Specifically, CONAI published a program with 10 demands. This included the reduction of consumption of fossil fuels and fair pricing of agricultural products, both which directly affect the livelihood of native communities. During these protests, one protester described how President Lasso, offered to work with indigenous people, but he doesn't know who indigenous people are or what indigenous people need, because most of us are in poverty, underscoring how important mobilization is in helping to increase visibility. CONAI has come head-to-head with the Ecuadorian government on several occasions and has managed to win many of their demands, showcasing the power they have in uniting the indigenous voices of Ecuador. For example, on June 30th of 2022, the Ecuadorian government succumbed to the pressure of protesters because, according to the government, the first 8 days of the protest cost them more than $110 million. As a result of this pressure, state officials and CONAI reached an agreement that cut the prices of fuel, repealed decrees that attempted to deregulate both the oil and gas industry. They also prohibited mining in indigenous territories as well as archaeological and water-protected areas. And similar to CONAP, they also helped organize several community projects, such as hosting a self-care and emotional therapy workshop for indigenous women. This workshop provides participants with individual and group strengthening through therapeutic work for people who have experienced and survived physical violence. And for the youth, CONAI hosts a youth camp where they push the youth to learn and embrace indigenous languages and customs. And they also learn about CONAI's political projects, like fighting the contamination that results from mining. Through organizing, educating, and empowering communities, demanding rights, reestablishing indigenous sovereignty, and defending their bodies and their territories, advocacy organizations play a significant role in helping address the systemic issues that affect today's social, political, and economic structures by centering and mobilizing community voices. They are essential in providing justice in spaces where the state simply won't, as the state reflects the interests of the political elite and not of the marginalized. These movements are especially important to help keep states accountable and to continue the push for meaningful change. In a world where there's more and more push for investing in building walls and increasing spending on police and military forces, we must truly ask ourselves, where do we fit in all of this? Whether or not you have a personal connection to Latin America, there is much that you can learn from studying how different communities have responded and fought back against the systemic problems in their region, as the issues they tackle don't only exist within the borders of their countries. especially in the context of how heavily connected the world is through global capitalism. These organizations are only part of the many that are doing exemplary work towards a more equitable world. And if you're feeling inspired, then you should know that groups like them most likely exist near you, no matter where you are. I encourage you to look into ways you can continue to educate yourself and get involved in your own community, whether that be volunteering at a local food pantry or community garden. You don't need to start big, and there are already so many people right now who are participating. But you have to consider how you can contribute to a just future, because it's a collective effort that won't come easily.
I can't be a pessimist because I'm alive. To be a pessimist means that you have agreed that human life is an academic matter. So I'm forced to be an optimist. I'm forced to believe that we can survive whatever we must survive.